when I create the object of the class, the constructor belonging to that class is get invoked automatically. What are the parameters I'm going to pass? That is 101 is nothing but the employee ID. How I'm going to call the constructor? That is, first I want to call the constructor which belongs to the base class. Hello to all, a warm welcome to my yet another session on inheritance and polymorphism. I'm Revati, faculty from the Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, first grade college, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. So dear student, before going to start my today's session, let me to recall the topic what I have covered in my previous session of this unit. So dear student, there I started with inheritance. So what is inheritance? This word is made up of two words, in and herit. That means I'm going to inherit the features from other class. So it is nothing but the reusability. I'm going to make use of existing thing. Then under this topic I have discussed base class and derived class. So what is base? That is parent. And what about derived? That's nothing but the child. Along with that, I have discussed type of inheritance. That is single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, hierarchical inheritance, as well as multiple inheritance. So dear student, which point you have to remember here? That is Java as well as C# does not support multiple inheritance. For that, I'm going to have the concept called interface. So what is interface? That includes abstract, data member, and abstract methods. These are the few topics I have covered in my last session of this unit. But now I'm going to deal with what is constructor, the two type of constructor, that is default constructor as well as parameterized constructor. Along with that, I'm going to discuss the relationship between inheritance and constructor in C#. These are the few topics I'm going to deal in my today's session. Now, what is the topic of the day? That is constructor. Construct. So what is constructor? Constructor is a special method or special member function which is invoked automatically. How it is invoked automatically? So dear student, please remember that the class name must be same as constructor name. For example, think that I have class called A. Now, while creating method, I'm going to create A. What is the similarity between these two? This is class name, but this is method name. But class name must be same as method name. That is, method name must be same as class name. And when I create the object of the class, the constructor belonging to that class is get invoked automatically. So constructor is a special method which is invoked or which is triggered automatically at the time of object creation. That means when I create object for class A, this particular constructor named A is going to triggered or invoked. So at the time of object creation, it is used to initialize the data members of that is new object generally. So constructors are mainly used to initialize the data members. The constructor in C has the same name as the class name. What is the use of constructor? It's mainly used to initialize the data members. And how I'm going to initialize? While creating object, I'm going to pass the value. And another point, class name must be same as the method name. And constructor does not have any return type. Constructor does not have any return type, even though it does not have void. So there are two type of constructor. One is default constructor and another one is parameterized constructor. And constructors are mainly used to initialize the data member. And the constructors are invoked when I'm going to create the object. So these are the few points you have to remember while studying about constructor. And what are the types? Default constructor and parameterized constructor. So what is default constructor? A constructor without parameter is known as default constructor. So a constructor which has no argument. The constructor without parameter, in the sense what? No argument, is known as default constructor, and it is invoked during the time of object. That means when I create object for that particular class, the constructor present in that class is get invoked, because class name same as the constructor name. Now this is the example here. So dear student, what is my statement always? That is using system. So dear student, what is my class name? That is employee. And what is this? This is my constructor. So this is my class name. And this is my constructor. So constructor name as well as class name must be same. To indicate this constructor, what I'm going to do? I'm going to use opening and closing parenthesis. But it does not have any return type. And this is my format specifier. That means I'm going to specify the visibility of this constructor. In that, I'm going to write, this is the example for default constructor. Now, inside this class, I'm going to create the main function and I'm going to create the object. So what is my class name? Employee. And what is my object? That is E1. And when I create the object of the type employee, the constructor which belongs to class employee is get invoked. Now second time, see here, employee, my class name. E2 is nothing but my object name, and when I create E2 object, the constructor belongs to employee class is get invoked. So this is the way I can able to write and use constructor in my program. Now I'm going to have my second type of constructor, that is parameterized constructor. So what is parameter? That's nothing but the arguments. That means while calling constructor, I'm going to specify the parameter. And from where I'm going to receive the parameter? While creating object, I'm going to pass the argument. So a constructor which has parameter. So what is parameter? That's nothing but the argument. That means a function with argument is called parameterized constructor, and it is used to provide distinct value to the object. So it is used to provide different or distinct to distinct object. different values to distinct object. This is the example program. See here, I have the class called employee. In this employee class, I'm going to have three data members. One is ID, that is employee ID, and it's of type integer. Then I have name, it's of type string. Then I have salary, it's of type floating point. Now I'm going to use parameterized constructor. See here, this method name same as class name. But what's the difference? It's going to have the parameter. And what are the parameters? That is I, N and S. So I is nothing but employee ID, N is nothing but name, S is nothing but salary. Now I'm going to write display function. So this display method is nothing but the ordinary method, but this is the constructor and this is method. Now in this method, I'm going to print employee ID, employee name and employee salary. Now I'm going to create another class called test employee. In that, I'm going to create main function. Inside main function, I'm going to create the object of type employee. And when I create an object of the type employee, the particular constructor belongs to this employee class get invoked. And what are the parameters I'm going to pass? That is 101 is nothing but the employee ID. And Sono is nothing but the employee name. Then this floating point value is nothing but the salary. Second time, once again, I'm going to create the object, that is E2. And what are the information I'm going to pass? 102, Mahesh and 49,000. Now, suppose if I want to display the content, then I'm going to call E1.display and E2.display. And dear student, please remember here, when I create an object of the type employee, the constructor belongs to this class is going to get invoked. So this is the beauty of parameterized constructor. Now I'm going to have inheritance as well as constructor. That means how I'm going to use constructor in my inheritance. So dear student, if I consider inheritance, it's nothing but reusability. And if I consider inheritance, I have base class as well as derived class. And if I consider constructor, the name of the constructor must be same as the class name. Then how I can able to link inheritance as well as constructor? So dear student, first what I want to do, I want to write the inheritance. In that, I'm going to implement constructor. So dear student, think that I have parent class. For that parent class, I must have the constructor. Then I have the child class. For that child class also, I want to define child class constructor. So if you provide the constructor in the derived class, what is derived class here? That is nothing but the child class. You must provide an appropriate constructor in the base class. Base is parent. That means, suppose if I want to define constructor in my child class, then I must have to define constructor in my parent class. If you have provide a constructor in the derived class. That means, suppose if I created constructor in my child class, but no constructor in my parent class, then I'm going to get the compiler error. Suppose I have a constructor in the derived class. That means in my subclass, I have the constructor, and in the base class, I have the constructor. Remember that the base class constructor will be called first. That means, think that if I have constructor in my base class as well as in my derived class. But how I'm going to call the constructor? That is, first I want to call the constructor which belongs to the base class. That will be called first, then the derived class constructor. That means I'm going to call the constructor which belongs to parent class at the first time. Then I'm going to call the constructor which belongs to child class. Now, this is the example program I'm going to have here. See, this is my base class. Base is nothing but the parent. And I'm going to create the constructor. So, constructor name must be same as the class name. So, this is my constructor which is present in my parent class, and I'm going to write inside the base class. At the same time, I'm going to have the destructor. Why I want to have the destructor here? So, dear student, when I create an object, the memory for that object is initialized. Now, suppose if I want to deallocate the memory, I repeat, once I initialize the object, the memory for that object is get allocated. Now, I want to deallocate the memory of that object. For that reason, I'm going to have the destructor. Why I'm going to use destructor? In order to deallocate the memory. How I'm going to define destructor? That is, first I want to write tilde symbol along with the constructor name. And when I write tilde symbol as well as constructor name, then it is known as destructor. Inside this, I'm going to write inside base class destructor. Now, see here, what is the topic? Inheritance as well as constructor. That means I want to implement inheritance. Along with that, I want to implement constructor. So, this is the base class along with the constructor. Now, see here, I have the derived class. This is nothing but the child. And this child is going to acquire the properties of parent class. Now, I'm going to have the function called derived. I'm going to have the function called derived. Now, this is nothing but the constructor, and constructor name must be class name. So, dear student, here constructor name must be class name. Inside this constructor, I'm going to have the message called inside the derived class. Now, I have the destructor. So, what is the message inside the destructor? That is inside the derived destructor. So, dear student, how to remember the sequence? Inheritance and constructor. So, I want to create inheritance. In that, I'm going to implement the constructor. So, if it is inheritance, base class and derived class, then if it is constructor, the method name must be class name and there is no return type. So, this is the way I can able to use inheritance as well as constructor. Now, how I'm going to invoke the inheritance, or how I'm going to inherit derived class. So dear student, first I want to create the object, and for which class I'm going to create the object? For the derived class, I'm going to create the object. And when I create the object, which class is going to execute first? That is base class. So I'm going to get the message like inside base class constructor. After the completion of base class execution, I'm going to get the message like inside the derived class constructor. So what is base? That is nothing but the parent, and derived is nothing but the child. So to use inheritance as well as constructor concept, what are the things I want to remember? That is, suppose if I'm going to define the constructor in my base class, then my derived class must have the constructor. Okay, otherwise compiler is going to generate an error message. So this is the way I can able to use constructor in inheritance. So dear student, in my today's session, I started with what is constructor. Along with that, I have covered two type of constructor, that is parameterized constructor and default constructor. Along with that, I have covered how inheritance as well as constructors are related each other. That means how can I use constructor in my interface. So these are the certain topic I have discussed in my today's session. Now in my next session, I'm going to deal with method overriding. That means how I can able to override the method. Along with that, I'm going to define what is method hiding. Along with that, I'm going to discuss what is abstract keyword and how I'm going to create abstract data members as well as methods. So these are the certain topic I'm going to discuss in my next session. Anyway, dear student, let's meet in the next session with the concept called overriding as well as abstraction. Until that, keep watching and keep learning. Thank you.